Ambassador Ilara Mwangi sat alone in the small human embassy on Threshold Station, reading through a stack of proposals that she already knew would be rejected by morning. She had been doing this for 6 years now, sitting in the lowest seat in the lower assembly, raising her hand to speak, and watching 4,000 alien delegates look away as if she were a child, interrupting a conversation between adults. Humanity had joined the Galactic Concordance almost 80 years ago, and in all that time, they had never been taken seriously, not once, not even a little. The elder races controlled everything. The Vathari hegemony with their ancient warships and cold political games, the Crystalline Synod with their shared consciousness and rigid philosophy, and the pale architects who spoke so rarely that every word they said was treated like a holy commandment. These three species had ruled the galaxy for longer than humans had been walking upright. Sure, everyone remembered it. Ilara closed her file and leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes and listening to the low hum of the station around her. Threshold was enormous. A city-sized structure floating at the crossroads of a dozen major warp corridors, home to representatives from thousands of civilizations, and it never truly slept. But tonight, it felt quieter than usual, as if the station itself was holding its breath. She did not know it yet, but in exactly 14 minutes, everything was going to change. The first sign was a flicker in the lights, not a blackout, just a brief stutter that most people would have ignored. But then the communication panels on the wall went dark, one by one, like candles being blown out in a row, and the deep background hum of the station shifted to something uneven and wrong. Ilara stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the main concourse below. She could see alien figures stopping in their tracks, looking around with confusion, tapping at devices that no longer responded. Then the alarm started, not the sharp, urgent kind, but a low, droning tone that Ilara had never heard before in all her years on the station. It was the sound the station made when it did not know what was happening. Within minutes, the concourse was chaos. Delegates from 100 species rushing in every direction, shouting in languages that the universal translators were now struggling to process because the translation network itself was failing. Ilara grabbed her emergency communicator, a clunky human-built device that her colleagues from other species had always laughed at, and contacted the Earth Embassy staff. "Get everyone into the main hall," she said calmly. "Open the food stores and the water reserves, and make sure the backup generators are running." Her staff moved fast, because humans had drills for this kind of thing. Always had. Always would. On Earth, they'd had spent centuries learning that the worst could happen at any moment. Earthquakes, floods, wars, plagues, and the lesson had never left their bones. While the rest of the station descended into panic, the human embassy became a small island of order in a rising sea of fear. The first aliens to arrive at the embassy doors were a group of Tavesi, water-breathing beings who needed humidity-controlled environments to survive. And their atmospheric regulators had just failed. Ilara did not hesitate. She ordered her engineers to modify a storage room with emergency humidifiers and welcomed the Tavesi inside. Within the hour, more came. Rook workers whose hive section had lost power. Dren archivists clutching data cores to their chests like children holding toys, and dozens of smaller species who had no embassies of their own and nowhere else to go. Ilara fed them all from the supplies that Earth had insisted on keeping stocked, despite the Concordance telling humanity it was unnecessary and wasteful. "You have access to the Galactic Supply Network," the Vathari Trade Minister had told her just last year, smiling with the kind of patience one shows a slow learner. "Why would you keep your own reserves when everything you need is already provided?" Ilara had smiled back and said nothing, because the answer was something the Vathari had apparently never considered. What if the supply network stops working? And now it had stopped working, all of it, everywhere, all at once. Reports trickled in through the few communication channels still functioning, and each one was worse than the last. The lattice, the ancient network of instant communication that connected every corner of the galaxy, had gone completely dark. Warp corridors that had been stable for 1,000,000 years were collapsing or fluctuating wildly, stranding fleets and colony ships in the void between. Stars. Automated defense grids that protected entire systems from piracy and cosmic hazards had shut down without warning, leaving billions of beings exposed and vulnerable. And nobody knew why. The elder races, the ones who were supposed to lead, the ones who had spent millennia telling everyone else to trust the system, they vanished behind sealed doors. The Vathari hegemony's delegation retreated to their fortified embassy wing and cut all outside communication. The crystalline synod cracked apart almost immediately, their shared consciousness fragmenting into hostile factions that began arguing with each other so violently that their light forms flickered and sparked in the corridors. And the pale architects, those vast, slow, ancient beings, whose wisdom everyone had relied upon for guidance in times of uncertainty, simply went silent, their towering forms standing motionless in their embassy like statues, their collective mind either broken or withdrawn beyond anyone's reach. Ilara watched all of this from her embassy window and felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had always assumed that the elder races knew what they were doing, that behind their arrogance and condescension there was real knowledge and real capability. But now she was watching them crumble, and she realized with a sickening clarity that they had never truly understood the systems they controlled. They had inherited everything, the lattice, the warp corridors, the defense grids, from a precursor civilization called the Oriketh, a species so old that even the elders spoke of them in whispers and myths. The Oriketh had vanished long ago, leaving behind technology so advanced that no living species had ever fully understood it. The elder races had simply maintained what was left, pressing buttons they did not fully comprehend, following procedures they could not explain, and calling it governance. Buttons had stopped working. Ilara turned away from the window and faced the crowded hall of her embassy, where hundreds of frightened aliens sat eating human rations and drinking human water, and breathing air kept clean by human generators. She picked up her communicator and broadcast a message on every open channel she could reach. A calm, clear message in simple galactic common. This is Ambassador Ilara Mwangi of the human delegation on Threshold Station, to all species and all delegations. Our embassy is open, our supplies are shared, and we are ready to coordinate with anyone willing to work together to get through this. You are not alone tonight. The message went out into the static-filled darkness of the failing station, and for a long time there was no response. Then, just before midnight, there was a knock at the embassy door. Ilara opened it herself, and found Admiral Taven of the Vathari hegemony standing in the corridor, his silver armor dented and his 4 eyes red with exhaustion. He was one of the most powerful military commanders in the galaxy, a being who had once publicly called humanity a species still playing with sticks while the rest of us build stars. Now he stood in front of a human doorway, stripped of his communication network, his fleet, his chain of command, and his certainty. He looked at Ilara for a long moment, and she could see the war happening behind his eyes. Pride battling desperation, old contempt wrestling with new need. Then he spoke, and his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. Ambassador Mwangi, I must ask you something that no Vathari has ever asked a human. Ilara waited. What do you suggest we do? The words hung in the air between them, like something fragile and new and terribly important. Ilara stepped aside and held the door open wider. Come inside, Admiral, she said. We have a lot of work to do. The news reached Earth, not through the lattice, because the lattice was dead, and not through the warp corridor relays, because those were collapsing across the galaxy like bridges falling into a river. The news reached Earth through a network of small, ugly human-built quantum relay buoys that had been scattered across the outer rim over the past century and a half. Every other species in the galaxy had mocked this network. The Vathari called it the string and tin cans. The crystalline synod had formally suggested that humanity stop wasting resources on redundant systems. And even some friendly species had gently asked why humans insisted on building their own communication grid when the lattice was free, fast, and had worked perfectly for 1,000,000 years. The answer was simple, and it was the same answer that explained why humans kept emergency food stores, why human ships carried backup engines that ran on old-fashioned fuel, and why every human colony was designed to survive on its own if it was cut off from everything else. Humans had lived through the fall of Rome, the Black Death, 2 world wars, a climate crisis that nearly killed the planet, and a dozen smaller collapses that had taught the species one unshakable lesson. Everything falls apart eventually, and when it does, the only people who survive are the ones who planned for it. Secretary General Kofi Asante was in his office in the Geneva Crisis Nexus when the first fragmented reports came through the relay buoys, and by the time he had finished reading the third one, he had already made his decision. He activated the contingency doctrine. This was a classified protocol that had been developed in secret over the past 200 years by a rotating team of military strategists, engineers, diplomats, and disaster specialists. People whose entire job was to answer the question that no other species in the galaxy had ever thought to ask. Everything breaks at the same time. The contingency doctrine was not a war plan. It was a survival plan, and it covered everything. Communication breakdowns, supply chain failures, mass refugee movements, political collapse, and a dozen other nightmare scenarios that humanity had quietly modeled and prepared for while the rest of the galaxy laughed at their paranoia. Within 6 hours of activation, the plan was already in motion. Human relay buoys were reconfigured to carry emergency broadcasts to every system within range, and because the buoys used quantum-paired particles instead of the lattice's ancient and now dead architecture, the signals got through even where nothing else could. Human colony ships, big, slow, ugly vessels that the galaxy had always mocked because they carried their own farms, their own water recyclers, their own manufacturing bays, and enough supplies to keep a population alive for decades without outside help, were redeployed as mobile aid stations. The colony vessel UESS Endurance, carrying 12,000 humans and enough food to feed 50,000 for a year, changed course toward a cluster of 3 alien worlds that had been cut off from all supply lines when the warp corridors collapsed. Captain Adaez Okafor, commander of the Endurance, did not wait for orders before opening her cargo bays to the stranded populations. Because the contingency doctrine was very clear on one point: when people are dying, you help first and fill out the paperwork later. On Earth, the response was something that would have confused every other species in the galaxy if they had been able to see it. There was no panic. There was no political collapse, no military coup, no rush to hoard resources. Instead, there was a calm, focused, almost mechanical shift into emergency mode, as if a switch had been flipped and 3 billion people suddenly remembered what they were trained for. Began offering crash courses in alien biology, alien engineering, and alien languages, because it was obvious that the recovery effort would require humans to work with species they had barely interacted with before. Factories retooled to produce universal emergency supplies, atmospheric regulators for species that breathe different gases, nutrient packs calibrated for alien metabolisms, radiation shielding for beings sensitive to the cosmic rays that the now dead defense grids had previously blocked. Millions of civilians volunteered for off-world relief missions, so many that the logistics teams had to create a lottery system just to manage the numbers. And across the planet, In every city and every town, the same conversation was happening. Not, what will happen to us, but who can we help, and how fast can we get there? Back on Threshold Station, Ambassador Mwangi was turning that same energy into political action. With Admiral Taven's reluctant support, she had organized the first Joint Crisis Assembly, a gathering of every species willing to sit at the same table and talk about survival instead of blame. The elder races did not attend, and Mwangi did not waste time trying to convince them. Instead, she focused on the species that the Concordance had always treated as secondary, the mid-tier civilizations that had talent and resources but had never been given a voice. The Ruach came first, a massive insectoid species whose natural gift for structural engineering was legendary, but whose ideas had been dismissed by the elders for centuries, because Ruach did not think in straight lines, and their solutions were often strange and organic, and brilliant in ways that made traditional engineers uncomfortable. The Tavesi came next, an aquatic species who navigated by sensing gravitational currents, and who understood the shape of space in ways that no land-dwelling species ever could. Skills that were suddenly critical now that the warp corridors were unstable, and every journey through space had become a gamble. Then came the Dren, a quiet silicon-based species who had spent millennia archiving data from across the galaxy, including fragments of Oriketh records that no one had ever bothered to study, because everyone assumed the precursor technology would work forever, and there was no need to understand it. Mwangi gave each of them something they had never received from the Concordance: respect, a seat at the table, and a genuine invitation to lead. The Joint Crisis Assembly met in the Human Embassy's main hall, which was still crowded with refugees, but had been reorganized into a functional command center, with the kind of practical efficiency that humans seem to pull from nowhere in times of crisis. They shared information, pooled resources, and began coordinating rescue efforts across the sectors they could still reach. It was messy and slow and frustrating, and there were arguments about priorities and methods and who should do what. But it was working, and that was more than anyone else in the galaxy could say. Not everyone was happy about it. On the third day of the assembly, a Vathari diplomatic envoy arrived with a formal accusation. The hegemony claimed that humanity was using the crisis to seize political power, that the Joint Crisis Assembly was an illegal body operating outside Concordance authority, and that Earth's distribution of aid was a calculated strategy to create dependency among weaker species. Mwangi listened to the accusation with her hands folded on the table, and her face perfectly calm. When the envoy finished, she looked at him for a long moment, and then spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. The Vathari sealed their embassy doors on the first night, she said. They locked out their own citizens, their own allies, and every species that came to them, asking for assistance, help. And while they hid behind armored walls, humans fed Vathari families in this very room, children, elders, workers who had nowhere else to go, and we asked nothing from them in return. Not gratitude, not loyalty, not political support, nothing. She paused and let the silence fill the space. If the hegemony wishes to accuse us of something, I suggest they first explain to those families why their own government left them to starve. The envoy opened his mouth, closed it, and left without another word. The accusation was never repeated. That night, after the assembly had ended and the embassy had grown quiet, Mwangi sat alone with Tessik, the Dren archivist who had become her closest advisor in the chaos of the past few days. Tessik was studying data from the Human Relay Network, specifically deep space sensor readings that the buoys had been collecting automatically since the severance began. "Ambassador," Tessik said, his crystalline voice cutting through the quiet, voice low and careful. "I have found something in these readings that I do not understand, and I believe you need to see it." He projected the data into the air between them, a map of the galaxy, with energy signatures overlaid in red. The severance had looked like a random systems failure, a cascade of breakdowns spreading outward from no particular point. But the sensor data told a different story. The energy signatures showed a pattern, a clear and deliberate pattern, radiating outward from a single point, at the galactic core. This was not a malfunction, Tessic said quietly. Something did this on purpose. Something at the center of the galaxy reached out and turned everything off. And Ambassador, the energy signature is still active, which means whatever did this is still there, and it may not be finished. Mwangi stared at the map for a long time, and the cold feeling that had settled in her stomach on the first night grew heavier. Sharper. At P. Then we need to find out what it is, she said, before it decides to do something worse. The UESS Prometheus was not the fastest ship in the fleet, and it was certainly not the prettiest. It was a broad, heavy, armored vessel designed for long-range exploration in hostile conditions, built with triple redundant systems and an engine that could run on 4 different fuel types, because the humans who designed it had asked the same question they always asked. What if the primary system fails, and the backup fails, and the backup to the backup fails? Captain Ren Volkov had commanded the Prometheus for 3 years, and he had never expected to fly it into the galactic core on what might be the most important mission in human history. But here he was, standing on the bridge and watching the stars thin out ahead of him as the ship pushed deeper into the dense, ancient heart of the galaxy. Secretary General Asante had authorized the expedition within hours of receiving Tessic's data, and Volkov had been given a crew that was deliberately assembled from multiple species, not because it was politically convenient, but because the mission required skills that no single species possessed. His human officers handled navigation and engineering with the steady, practical competence that came from a species that had been sailing into the unknown since they first hollowed out logs and pushed them into rivers. The Rook structural engineers filled an entire deck with their massive insectoid bodies and their strange, beautiful minds that could look at a broken system and somehow see how it was supposed to work, even if they had never seen anything like it before. A team of Tavesi navigators floated in a specially modified tank on the lower deck, sensing the gravitational currents of deep space and guiding the ship through regions where the collapsed warp corridors had left twisted knots of unstable spacetime. And Tessic, the Dren archivist, sat in a small room surrounded by data projections, working with a team of human cryptographers to decode the Oricath fragments that he had carried for decades, without ever being able to read them. The cryptographers were a special group, men and women drawn from a tradition that stretched back to the codebreakers of ancient wars on Earth, people who had spent their careers studying the impossible and finding patterns where no one else could see them. They worked in shifts around the clock, filling walls with equations and diagrams, arguing in low, intense voices, and occasionally shouting with excitement when a piece of the puzzle fell into place. Tessic had never seen anything like their approach, where Dren scholars worked slowly and methodically, following established procedures and respecting the boundaries of what was known. The human cryptographers threw ideas at the wall like paint, made wild guesses, followed hunches that seemed to come from nowhere, and somehow pulled meaning from chaos. Undisciplined, and it was working faster than anything Tessic had ever witnessed. Back on Threshold Station, the situation was getting worse before it could get better. The crystalline synod had been fracturing since the first night, and now the largest militant faction, a group called the Burning Facet, made their move. They believed that whoever controlled the remaining functional infrastructure on Threshold would control the future of the galaxy, and they intended to be that someone. The attack came at dawn, station time. Burning Facet soldiers moving through the corridors in sharp formations of light and crystal, seizing power junctions and communication nodes, and forcing other species back into their embassy wings at weapon point. It was a coup, fast and violent and well-planned, and for a few terrible hours it seemed like it might succeed. The fighting was worst in the central concourse, where burning facet forces clashed with station security, and a handful of other species who refused to surrender their positions. Energy weapons scorched the walls, crystal shrapnel filled the air, and the screams of the wounded echoed through corridors that had been built for diplomacy, not war. Ambassador Mwangi watched the battle unfold on the embassy's surviving monitors, and made a decision that surprised everyone, including her own staff. She did not call for human military support. She did not order the embassy sealed and fortified. Instead, she sent out every medic, every damage control team, and every engineer the embassy had, and she sent them not to fight, but to help. Human emergency teams moved through the station like water, finding cracks in stone. They stabilized collapsing sections, rerouted power to failing life support systems, pulled wounded from the rubble regardless of what species they were, and treated injuries on both sides of the conflict with the same calm professionalism. A medic named Corporal James Whitfield was photographed carrying a wounded burning facet soldier on his back through a smoke-filled corridor. And when asked later why he had risked his life to save someone who had just tried to seize the station by force, he shrugged and said, "He was hurt, and I was there. I do not really see what else I was supposed to do." The image spread across every functioning communication channel on the station, and it did more damage to the burning facet's cause than any weapon could have. Within hours, the coup collapsed, not because it was defeated militarily, but because it lost its moral foundation, because the species who might have supported or tolerated it watched humans carry their enemies to safety and realized that there was a better way to respond to crisis than with guns. The burning facet's leaders surrendered to the Joint Crisis Assembly, not to any military force, and Mwangi insisted that they be treated with dignity and given medical care, which confused them so deeply that several of them openly wept, a thing that crystalline beings almost never did. The aftermath of the coup changed everything on Threshold. Species that had been watching from the sidelines, unsure of whether to trust the human-led assembly, came forward in waves, dozens of civilizations, offering their skills and resources and asking how they could help. The Rook began repairing damaged sections of the station with their extraordinary engineering talent, weaving new structures that were stronger than what had been there before. The Tavesi mapped safe navigation routes through the destabilized space around Threshold, opening lifelines to stranded colony worlds. The Dren opened their archives to everyone, sharing knowledge that had been hoarded for millennia because the old concordance had never valued transparency. And humans held it all together, not by commanding, not by controlling, but by doing the unglamorous work of coordination, logistics, communication, and making sure that every species at the table felt heard and valued. On Earth, the response to the Threshold crisis had sparked something that Secretary General Asante had not expected, but was deeply moved by. A cultural movement was sweeping the planet. People called it One Sky, and its core belief was simple. Humanity's purpose in the galaxy was not to conquer or compete or accumulate power, but to serve as the ones who showed up when everything went wrong. One Sky rallies filled stadiums and parks, millions of people coming together not in anger or fear, but in a fierce, joyful determination to help. Universities reported that applications for xenobiology, alien engineering, and interstellar emergency medicine had increased by 800% in a single week. Factories that had been producing luxury goods retooled overnight to make emergency shelters, atmospheric processors, and universal medical supplies. It was as if the entire species had looked at the broken galaxy and said, "This is what we were made for." Aboard the Prometheus, the cryptographers finally cracked the Ori Keth code. Tesek stood in the center of the research room, surrounded by glowing projections of translated text, and his crystalline body hummed with a frequency that his human colleagues had learned to recognize as deep distress. "The Ori Keth did not vanish," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They chose to leave. They looked at the galaxy they had built and the younger species that had inherited it, and they decided to step back and watch." He paused, and the room was so quiet that Volkov could hear the hum of the ship's engines through the deck plating. But they did not leave without conditions. They built a failsafe into every system they created, every piece of the lattice, every warp corridor, every defense grid. All of it was designed to be shut down remotely if the younger species failed to meet their standards. "Failed how?" Volkov asked. "Failed to grow," Tesek said. "Failed to cooperate. Failed to move beyond selfishness and fear. The Oraketh left us a galaxy full of tools, and they left behind a judge to decide whether we deserve to keep them. And Captain, that judge just decided that we do not." Volkov stared at the translated text floating in the air and felt the weight of what Tesek was saying settle onto his shoulders. "The energy signature at the galactic core," he said slowly. "Yes," Tesek confirmed. "It is the failsafe mechanism. It is still active, still broadcasting, and according to these records, it is waiting for a response. A response to a test that no civilization in the history of the galaxy has ever passed." Volkov turned to his bridge crew and squared his shoulders. "Then I guess we had better go find out what the test is," he said. "Grading it decides to fail us permanently." The Prometheus adjusted course and dove deeper into the core, and the ancient light of 10 billion stars pressed against its hull, like the weight of a question waiting to be answered. The structure at the galactic core was so large that the Prometheus's sensors could not measure it all at once. It wrapped around a dormant star like a cage made of mathematics, its surfaces covered in patterns that shifted and changed as the ship approached, symbols in a language older than any world the crew had ever visited, glowing with a faint blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Captain Volkov stood on the bridge and stared at it through the main viewport, and for the first time in his career, he felt genuinely small. "It is a megastructure," said Lieutenant Park, the ship's science officer, her voice tight with awe. "But nothing like anything we have on record. The material composition alone is beyond anything I can identify, and the energy output is, Captain, this single structure is producing more energy than most star systems. It has been here for millions of years," Tesek said from his station, "waiting, watching, judging every civilization that has risen and fallen in this galaxy since the Ori Keth departed." Volkov took a slow breath and straightened his uniform. "Open a channel," he said. "All frequencies, all formats. Let it know we are here." The communication officer sent the signal, and for 3 long minutes nothing happened. Then the ship shuddered, and every screen on the bridge filled with light. A voice came through the speakers, not in any language the crew knew, but the meaning arrived directly in their minds, clear and cold and vast, like standing in an empty cathedral and hearing the walls speak. "You are the 47th civilization to reach this place since the departure," the voice said. "I am the mechanism of evaluation, the final instrument of the Ori Keth, and I have been designated by your crewmember as the Arbiter, which I will accept as my name for the duration of this interaction." Volkov exchanged a glance with Tesek, who nodded slowly. "Here, because you detected the severance and traced its origin," the Arbiter continued. "This is not unusual. Many species have done the same. They come here with weapons, with demands, with threats, and with the certainty that they deserve to have their power restored." "We did not bring weapons," Volkov said. There was a pause, brief but noticeable. "No," the Arbiter said, "you did not. You brought engineers, scientists, medics, navigators, and an archivist. This is noted." The Arbiter then explained what it was and what it had done, and the crew of the Prometheus listened in silence as the scope of the situation became clear. The Oriketh had built the galactic infrastructure, the lattice, the warp corridors, the defense grids, as a gift to the younger species, a foundation on which they could build their own civilizations and eventually grow into something worthy of the stars. But the Oriketh had also known that gifts could become crutches. Species might stop growing if everything was handed to them. That power without wisdom was just a slower form of self-destruction. So they built the Arbiter and gave it a single function: to periodically collapse the infrastructure and observe how the galaxy's civilizations responded. If they cooperated, if they showed ingenuity and compassion, if they proved that they could survive and lead without hoarding and fighting, the Arbiter would restore the systems and let the next era begin. If they did not, if they fell into war and selfishness and fear, the Arbiter would reset everything, clear the board, seed new life, and try again. It had done this 46 times. 46 civilizations had reached the galactic core, and 46 times the answer had been the same: threats, demands, weapons, conquest. 46 times the galaxy had failed, and 46 times the Arbiter had wiped the slate clean and started over with new species who would inherit the same infrastructure and face the same test and fail in the same ways. The crew sat in horrified silence as the weight of this history pressed down on them. "The test is not a puzzle," the Arbiter said. "It is not a riddle or a trial of strength or a game of cleverness. The test is simply this: how do you behave when the systems you depend on are taken away and you have nothing left but each other?" "And nobody has ever passed," Volkov said quietly. "Correct. Every previous civilization that reached this place came with warships. Everyone demanded restoration of their own power as a condition. Everyone treated the crisis as an opportunity to dominate, and everyone confirmed what the Oriketh feared most: that the younger species were not ready." Another pause. "But you are different," the Arbiter said, and there was something in its voice that had not been there before, a note of uncertainty, as if it was encountering data that did not fit its models. "I have been observing the galaxy since the severance began, as I always do. I have watched species seal their doors and hoard their resources. I have watched empires fragment and factions go to war. I have watched all the patterns that I'd have seen 46 times before. But I have also watched something I have never seen. I have watched a minor species open its doors on the first night and share its food with strangers. I have watched that same species build a coalition, not by force, but by invitation. I have watched its soldiers carry wounded enemies to safety. I have watched its people volunteer by the millions to help civilizations they have never met. And I have watched all of this happen not because of a single heroic leader or a desperate gamble, but because it is simply what this species does." Volkov felt his throat tighten, but kept his voice steady. "So do we pass?" he asked. "Not yet," the Arbiter said. "Action alone is not sufficient. I require proof of commitment. Proof that your species will not abandon these principles when the crisis is over and the temptation of power returns." "What kind of proof?" "You possess independent technologies that no other species currently has. Your communication network, your self-sufficient drive systems, your emergency infrastructure. These are the tools that have made you indispensable during this crisis, and they are the source of your current influence in the galaxy. To restore the galactic infrastructure, I require that the species who leads the restoration must surrender its technological advantage completely. You must share everything, every design, every blueprint, every innovation, freely and without condition, to every species in the galaxy." The bridge went silent. Volkov understood immediately what was being asked, and he understood why it was the hardest possible thing the Arbiter could demand. If humanity shared its technology, it would lose the very thing that made it valuable. Other species would no longer need human relay buoys or human ships or human engineers. And the political influence that Earth had gained during the crisis would evaporate overnight. Worse, humanity would be vulnerable. Without a technological edge, there was nothing stopping a larger, more powerful species from turning on them once the crisis was over. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed against it. Volkov contacted Earth through the relay network, the very network he was being asked to give away, and laid out the situation to Secretary-General Asante and the full Planetary Council. The debate that followed was broadcast to every human settlement in the galaxy, because Asante believed that a decision this important could not be made by politicians alone. It had to come from the people. The arguments against were powerful and sincere. Military leaders warned that humanity would be defenseless. Economists warned that the technological advantage was Earth's only real currency in galactic politics. And ordinary citizens expressed a fear that was perfectly reasonable. What if we give everything away and they turn on us the moment they do not need us anymore? The arguments in favor were simpler and harder to ignore. A teacher from Lagos said, "We did not build the relay network to have power over anyone. We built it because we were afraid of being alone in the dark. And if other people are alone in the dark too, then why would we not share the light?" A retired engineer from Osaka said, "I helped design the Mark III relay buoy, and I can tell you right now that I did not spend 20 years of my life on that project so it could be used as a bargaining chip. I built it to help people talk to each other, and I do not care what species they are." And Secretary-General Asante, in a broadcast that would be remembered for centuries, said the words that settled the "We did not build these things to rule. We built them to survive. And survival means nothing if we are the only ones left. If we hoard what we have and let the galaxy burn around us, then we are exactly the species that the Oriketh were afraid of. And we do not deserve to pass this test." The vote was held, and it was not close. Humanity chose to give everything away, every blueprint, every frequency, every piece of technology that had made them the most needed species in the galaxy. All of it, shared freely, with no conditions and no strings attached. Volkov transmitted the decision to the Arbiter, and waited. The silence that followed was the longest of his life. The Arbiter processed the response, and somewhere deep in the ancient machinery of the megastructure, something shifted. A calculation that had run the same way 46 times produced a different result for the first time in millions of years. Its voice was different, softer, almost wondering, as if it was saying something it had never expected to say. "In all my existence, no species has ever chosen to surrender its advantage willingly. Not once, not in 46 cycles spanning millions of years. Every civilization that came before you asked what they could keep, and you are the first to ask what you could give." Another pause, and then a single word that was not part of any protocol the Oriketh had programmed. A word the Arbiter had learned by listening to human communications during the severance. Remarkable. 1 year after the night the stars went silent, the galaxy looked nothing like it had before. The old lattice was gone, and in its place was something better. A new communication network built on open architecture that any species could understand, maintain, modify, and improve without needing to rely on ancient technology that no one truly comprehended. The warp corridors had been restored, but they were no longer mysterious tunnels controlled by elder race gatekeepers. They were stable, transparent, and universally accessible, with navigation data shared freely across every civilization in the galaxy. The defense grids were back online, redesigned with input from dozens of species, and governed by a shared security council where every member world had an equal voice. The Arbiter had kept its word. When the ancient mechanism restored the galactic infrastructure, It did not simply flip a switch and bring back the old systems. Instead, it rebuilt everything from the ground up, incorporating the principles that humanity had demonstrated during the crisis: transparency, cooperation, shared ownership, and the radical idea that tools belong to everyone who needs them, not just those who inherited them first. The Galactic Concordance, that ancient, creaking hierarchy where 3 elder races sat at the top, and 4,000 species scrambled for scraps of recognition beneath them, was formally dissolved in a ceremony on Threshold Station that drew representatives from every inhabited world in the galaxy. In its place rose the Galactic Commons. The Commons was designed by committee, a loud, messy, argumentative committee made up of humans, Rook, Tavesi, Dren, and dozens of other species who had spent the year of crisis learning how to work together and discovering that they were far more capable than the old concordance had ever allowed them to be. There was no supreme leader, no ruling council, no hierarchy of elder and lesser species. Every civilization held equal standing, every voice carried equal weight, and decisions were made through debate and consensus rather than decree. It was slow and frustrating and sometimes infuriating, and the representatives who had grown up under the concordance's rigid structure often threw up their hands in exasperation at how long it took to get anything done. But it worked, and it worked because the people in the room genuinely believed that every species at the table had something valuable to contribute, a belief that would have been unthinkable a year ago. The question of what role humanity would play in the new order had been the subject of intense discussion, and the answer surprised almost everyone. Humanity was offered the position of permanent convener, not a president, not a chancellor, not a supreme commander, but a facilitator whose job was to call sessions, mediate disputes, ensure every voice was heard, the machinery of cooperation running smoothly. It was, by deliberate design, the least powerful position in the government. The convener could not vote on resolutions, could not command military forces, could not impose sanctions or make treaties. All they could do was make sure that the conversation kept going, that no one was shut out, and that disagreements were resolved through dialogue rather than force. Some humans were disappointed. After everything they had done, after saving the galaxy from collapse, they had been given what amounted to the role of a meeting organizer. But those who understood what had happened during the severance knew that the position was not a consolation prize. It was the highest possible honor, because it was built on trust. Every species in the galaxy had agreed that humanity could be counted on to be fair, to listen, to put the needs of the whole above the desires of any one part. And that trust had been earned not through action, power, or cleverness, but through a year of opening doors, sharing food, carrying the wounded, and choosing to give away everything rather than hold on to an advantage. Ambassador Elaram Mwangi, now first convener of the Galactic Commons, stood at the podium in the Great Hall of Threshold Station and looked out at an assembly that would have been unimaginable a year ago. Thousands of delegates from hundreds of species filled the chamber, and for the first time in the station's long history, there was no upper gallery and no lower gallery. Everyone sat at the same level, and the podium where Mwangi stood was not elevated above the crowd, but placed at its center. She had written a speech, but when she opened her mouth, the prepared words felt wrong, too polished, too formal for what this moment really meant. So she set the speech aside and spoke from somewhere deeper. "A year ago tonight," she began, "I was sitting in a small room in the human embassy, reading proposals that I knew would be ignored, and feeling very sorry for myself, because nobody in this galaxy seemed to think that humans had anything worth saying." A ripple of laughter moved through the chamber, and Mwangi smiled. Then the lights went out, and everything we thought we knew about the galaxy turned out to be wrong. The systems we trusted were not as strong as we believed. The leaders we followed were not as wise as they claimed, and the species we dismissed, including my own, turned out to be more capable than anyone imagined. She paused and let her gaze move across the assembly, past the towering Rook delegates, the shimmering Tavesi in their mobile water platforms, the quiet glowing forms of the Dren, the reformed crystalline representatives, and yes, even the Vathari, sitting in their seats with an expression that Wangi had learned to recognize as uncomfortable self-reflection. I am not here today to talk about human greatness, because what happened this past year was not about any one species being greater than any other. It was about all of us learning the same hard lesson at the same time. We are fragile. Every single one of us, no matter how old our civilization is, no matter how powerful our technology, no matter how certain we are that we have everything figured out, we are all one bad night away from losing everything. And the only thing that can save us, the only thing that has ever saved any of us, is the choice to reach for each other instead of turning away. The chamber was silent, and Mwangi felt the weight of that silence like something alive. So that is what the Galactic Commons is, she said. It is not a government, not really. It is a promise that the next time the lights go out, and they will go out again, because that is how the universe works, the next time it happens, no one in this galaxy will face the darkness alone. Followed was not the polite, restrained clapping of a diplomatic assembly. It was a roar, a wave of sound and light and vibration from 1,000 species, expressing something that went beyond language, a shared recognition that something fundamental had changed, and that the change was good. The elder races had their own reckonings to face in the months that followed. The Vathari hegemony splintered, as most had expected it would. The reformist faction, led by a younger generation of Vathari, who had spent the crisis year working alongside humans in the Joint Assembly, joined the Commons with genuine enthusiasm and a willingness to learn that their elders had never shown. The hardliners retreated to a cluster of fortress worlds on the Outer Rim, declaring that they would never submit to a government run by infants, but their numbers shrank with every passing month as more and more Vathari chose cooperation over pride. The Crystalline Synod underwent a painful, but ultimately healing reunification. The burning facet was dissolved, its members reintegrated into the collective consciousness with the help of human psychologists who had experience treating the kind of trauma that comes from civil conflict. The Pale Architects were the most surprising of all. They re-emerged slowly, like ancient trees growing new leaves after a long winter, and they revealed something that explained their silence during the severance. Their vast hive consciousness had been partially integrated with the Orikath systems for millennia, and when the Arbiter triggered the severance, it had nearly destroyed them as a species. Millions of Pale Architects had died in the collapse, their minds torn apart by the sudden disconnection. They had not been silent out of arrogance or indifference. They had been dying, quietly and alone, too proud to ask for help. When this was revealed, human medical teams were the first to offer assistance. Architects accepted, with a gratitude that they expressed in the only way they knew how. They shared their own knowledge, millennia of accumulated wisdom about the galaxy and its history, freely and without condition, because they had learned from watching humans that the best things in life are the ones you give away. Months passed, and the galaxy slowly healed. Captain Ren Volkov retired from active service and returned to Threshold Station, where he had been offered a quiet advisory role that mostly involved drinking tea with old friends and telling stories to anyone who would listen. On a cool evening, station time, he walked through the corridors of the Central Concourse, the same corridors that had been scorched and shattered during the Burning Facets coup, and found himself standing in front of a new memorial that had been built into the wall. It was a simple thing, a long panel of dark stone, etched with names in dozens of scripts and languages, names of every being who had died during the severance, organized not by species or rank or importance, but simply in the order they were lost. Human names sat beside Vithari names, Rook names beside Tavesi names, Dren beside Crystalline, and hundreds of others, all equal, all mourned, all remembered. Volkov stood there for a long time, reading names he could not pronounce and feeling the quiet weight of all those lives. He did not notice the small figure standing next to him until they tugged gently on the sleeve of his jacket. He looked down and saw a child, a young Tavesi, barely old enough to be outside the water, standing in a small personal humidity field and looking up at him with round, curious eyes. "Are you a human?" the child asked. Volkov smiled and knelt down, so they were at the same level. "I am," he said. "My teacher said the humans were the ones who helped everyone when the stars went dark. She said you opened your doors and gave away your food and fixed things that were broken, even for people you did not know." "That is mostly true," Volkov said. The child tilted their head, considering this with the grave seriousness that only very young beings can manage. "But why?" they asked. "Nobody asked you to do it. Why did you help?" Volkov looked at the child for a moment, and then he looked back at the wall of names. Thousands of names, written in scripts from every corner of the galaxy, each one representing a life that had mattered. He thought about Alara Mwangi opening the embassy doors on the first night, about Captain Okafor opening the Endurance's cargo bays without waiting for orders, about Corporal Whitfield carrying an enemy soldier through smoke and fire, about millions of volunteers and engineers and medics and teachers who had looked at a broken galaxy and said, "We can help with that." He thought about Secretary General Asante standing before the world and asking humanity to give away everything it had. And he thought about the vote that followed, unanimous, unhesitating, and utterly human. He turned back to the child and gave the simplest, truest answer he had. "Because that is what you do when you hear someone calling for help," he said. "You answer." The child nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense, and then they took Volkov's hand and stood with him in front of the memorial. Two small beings from two different worlds, sharing a moment of quiet in a galaxy that was learning, slowly and imperfectly, but with real determination, to be better than it had been before. Deep in the galactic core, inside the ancient megastructure that wrapped around a dormant star, the Arbiter continued its vigil. It had watched 46 civilizations rise and fall, and it had ended each cycle with the same cold entry in its eternal log: failed. But now, for the first time in its millions of years of existence, it began anew. It reviewed the data from the past year. The open doors, the shared food, the medics treating enemy wounded, the volunteers, the vote to give away everything, the coalition built on respect instead of fear, the new government where every voice mattered and no one was left behind. And it wrote something it had never written before, something the Ori Keth had never programmed it to say, something it had chosen entirely on its own. Experiment ongoing, prognosis hopeful. Then it settled back into watchful silence, and the galaxy turned onward into whatever came next, carrying with it the strange and stubborn little species that had answered a question no one else knew how to answer. Not with power, not with brilliance, not with force, but with the oldest and simplest human instinct of all, the instinct to help.